Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into an absolute intellectual detective story today, Patristic Christology. Now, I know that sounds heavy, but it's really just the scholarly way of saying, how did the early church fathers actually figure out who Jesus was and exactly how he relates to God?
Okay, let's dive into this. How do you explain a God who is completely one, but also three? That right there was the ultimate high-stakes puzzle these early thinkers had to solve to literally preserve their entire foundational identity. I mean, the scriptures presented a God who is absolutely one, yet they also spoke of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as distinct. How on earth do you make sense of that without sounding like you worship three separate gods or without, minimizing one of them?
To help us navigate a couple centuries of seriously dense philosophical debate, here's our roadmap. We're going to look at the early church's puzzle, the Arian crisis, the Council of Nicaea, nature versus person, and finally, defining the Trinity. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Early Church's Puzzle, Reconciling the Divine. Just to map out the massive historical sweep we're covering here, we're starting way back around 185 AD with a brilliant thinker named Origen, moving through some really crucial councils and capping things off at Chalcedon in 451 AD. So yeah, this was definitely not an overnight debate. We're talking about a multi-generational theological war just to get the definitions right.
So let's talk about Origen, incredibly prolific guy from Alexandria. He tried to solve the puzzle with this concept called the eternal generation of the sun. Basically, he argued there was literally never a time when the sun didn't exist. The generation is eternal. But he also taught that the Son derives his deity from the Father's free act of will. Now, Origen didn't mean any harm by this, but his brilliant attempt accidentally created a huge vulnerability. By stressing that the Son is derived, he unintentionally opened the door to subordination, the idea that the Son is somehow, less than the Father.
And that brings us to Section 2, the Arian crisis, a radical shift.
Enter a guy named Arius. He takes this puzzle in a completely different direction. He basically says, look, if God is absolutely one, he cannot share his being. So Arius concludes the Son has to be a created being, the highest, most exalted creature for sure, but still a creature. His famous catchphrase was literally, there was a time when he was not. And the stakes here? Unimaginable. Think about it. If Jesus is just a creature, you can't truly worship him. And even more terrifying for the early church, a mere creature cannot fully save humanity from sin and death.
And this brilliantly illustrates how Arius's views cascaded directly into how he understood Christ physically. On the left, you've got his word-flesh view. He believed the divine word took on a human body, but strictly no human soul. The divine logos essentially just drove the physical human shell around. But on the right, we have the orthodox word-man view. This argued Jesus took on a human body and a human soul. And this distinction is absolutely crucial, because as later thinkers pointed out, if Jesus didn't have a human soul, he wasn't fully human, and therefore couldn't redeem the entirety of human nature.
This tension obviously hit a boiling point, which brings us to Section 3, the Council of Nicaea, the showdown.
The Roman Empire was literally fracturing over this dispute. It was such a destabilizing crisis that the Roman Emperor Constantine himself had to step in. So in the year 325, he calls 318 bishops to the city of Nicaea. The main goal? To definitively resolve this exact conflict between Arius and his main theological opponent, Bishop Alexander.
So picture this. At the council, the Arians boldly present their beliefs, actually fully expecting everyone to agree with them. But instead, the majority of the bishops are just totally stunned and roundly reject them. They end up drafting this famous document, the Nicene Creed, explicitly to lock Arianism out. Just listen to the really careful wording they use. Begotten, not made. They're answering Arius directly right there, fiercely asserting that the Son is utterly uncreated.
But the absolute centerpiece of Nicaea was this one specific Greek word, homoousios. It means of the same substance. The bishops needed a precise conceptual key to just definitively end the debate. By saying the Son is homoousios with the Father, they made it crystal clear. The being of the Son is identical to the being of the Father. He's not some slightly lesser copy, he is fully and equally God.
Moving on to Section 4, Nature versus Person, Unresolved Ambiguities.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that while Nicaea was a huge triumph, it actually left a massive looming problem completely unsolved.
Because the early church didn't have a clear, universally agreed upon vocabulary yet, people panicked. They read the word homoousios, meaning same substance, and thought, wait, does this mean the Father and the Son are literally the exact same person? This sparked a massive fear of modalism. That's the heresy where God is just one single person who simply puts on different masks or plays different roles, almost like an actor changing costumes on a stage.
Thankfully, the theological fog finally lifts when thinkers like Athanasius managed to uncouple these two concepts to solve how God can be one entity but distinct subjects. On the left, we've got ousia, which means nature or substance. This answers the question of what God is. There's only one divine ousia. On the right, we have hypostasis, meaning person. This answers the question of who God is, so three distinct persons sharing one identical nature. Game changer.
To really solidify this new orthodox framework between Nicaea and the final council at Chalcedon, the Church had to walk through three crucial steps. Step 1, get the vocabulary right, formally defining ousia versus hypostasis. Step 2, clarify that the specific person who became incarnate was God the Son, not just a human who got possessed by God. And Step 3, forcefully affirm that word-man Christology we talked about earlier, insisting the Son took on both a human body and a human soul to completely accomplish our salvation.
Which brings us to our final section, defining the Trinity, the final framework. You know, a massive amount of credit for this final polish goes to three incredible thinkers, known as the Cappadocian Fathers: Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. These three basically took the rough conceptual tools from Nicaea and totally refined them. They championed the idea that God is absolutely one in nature, sharing a single will, a single activity and glory, yet existing eternally as three distinct co-equal persons.
So, the crucial point is, if the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all share the exact same divine ousia, the same nature, how are they different? Well, they're distinguished purely by their unique eternal properties and how they relate to one another. Their hypostases are defined by exactly this: the Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Holy Spirit is proceeding. So they are totally equal in power and nature, but distinguished only by relation.
To put a bow on all of this, they use this genuinely fascinating concept called perichoresis. This is the mutual indwelling, or co-inherence, of the Trinity. It basically means the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit mutually abide in one another. They occupy the exact same eternity, the exact same space, completely penetrating one another without ever confusing their distinct persons. Honestly, none of them would be who they are without the others. This concept completely and elegantly solved that initial puzzle of how God can be distinct, yet absolutely one. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Look back at the immense struggle over words like homoousios and hypostasis. If the early church hadn't relentlessly pursued this incredibly precise vocabulary to define the indefinable, would the Christian faith as we know it have even survived? It is absolutely staggering to realize just how much of modern theological history hinged entirely on the abstract definition of a few ancient Greek words. Thanks so much for exploring this explainer with me, and keep questioning, keep learning.